10,000 farmers stood outside Parliament on a cold November morning in 2024. Tractors lined Whitehall. Some carried signs that just said 4 words: no farmer, no food. And underneath all of it sat a single number nobody in that crowd believed. The government said this policy would only ever touch 500 farms a year. 500. Out of a country with tens of thousands of family farms. Nobody was buying it. Because the number the National Farmers Union was using wasn't 500. It was 70,000. That is not a rounding error. That is not two sides quibbling over a margin. That is 140 times apart, on the exact same piece of legislation, argued by people who all had access to the same Treasury data. This was never really a disagreement about a tax rate. It was two governments' worth of officials looking at the same policy and landing 140 times apart from each other. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly why that gap exists, and why the Prime Minister who introduced that number doesn't even hold the job anymore. Subscribe now, because this story does not end where you think it ends, and the last 3 minutes connect every part of it. Here is where it actually starts. Not in 2024. In 1992. That year, the Conservative government under John Major made a decision that shaped British farming for the next 3 decades. It exempted the intergenerational transfer of farms from inheritance tax entirely. 0%. The logic was simple and at the time uncontroversial. Land is not cash. A farmer's wealth is tied up in soil, sheds, and machinery, not in a bank account. Tax it like cash, and every generation would have to sell a piece of the farm just to keep the rest of it. So Britain decided, on a cross-party basis that held for 32 years, not to do that. Food security was the stated reason. Nobody seriously argued with it. That 32-year agreement ended in October 2024. Chancellor Rachel Reeves stood up in the House of Commons and announced, as part of that year's budget, that inherited agricultural assets worth more than £1 million would now be taxed. Not at the standard 40% rate that applies to most inherited wealth in Britain. At 20%, half the usual rate, and payable interest-free across 10 years if needed. On paper, that sounds almost gentle. In practice, it detonated something that had been settled law since before most working farmers were born. The backlash was immediate and it was enormous. By November 19th, more than 10,000 farmers had converged on Parliament Square. Some had driven tractors from Derbyshire, from Shropshire, from Worcestershire. One farmer near Buxton, Ben Ardern, told BBC Radio Derby the changes could be the end of British farming. He said that on a rainy morning in the Peak District to a local radio reporter, with no idea that a famous television presenter 3 counties south was about to reach for almost exactly the same 4 words. Because Jeremy Clarkson was at that same rally in London. And when a journalist asked him what the policy meant, he didn't hedge. He called it, on record, the end of farming. 2 men, 2 completely different lives. One a working hill farmer in Derbyshire nobody outside his village had heard of. The other one of the most famous broadcasters in Britain, worth an estimated 55 to 65 million pounds, who'd spent the previous 3 years turning his own 1,000-acre Cotswolds farm into a global television phenomenon. Neither one coordinated with the other. Both landed on the same phrase, independently, within weeks of each other. That is not a coincidence you can manufacture. That is what it sounds like when an entire industry reaches the same conclusion at the same moment, without being told to. Here's the part that gets lost in the noise of a protest headline. Clarkson himself is a strange test case for this policy, because he is simultaneously one of the wealthiest people it will ever touch, and one of the most visible faces of the argument that it shouldn't touch anyone at all. He bought his farm, 1,000 acres near Chipping Norton, formerly part of the Sarsden estate, back in 2008. For over a decade it was farmed on a contract basis by a local villager. Only in 2019, when that villager retired, did Clarkson decide to try running it himself. What started as a contractual obligation to make one more television program turned into Clarkson's Farm, the most watched Prime Video original series in the UK. None of that changes the arithmetic that's now sitting on his desk, or on the desk of every farmer like him. Nobody has published exactly what Diddley Squat is worth on paper, and this script isn't going to pretend otherwise. But you don't need an insider leak to do the maths. Knight Frank's own Farmland Index, the industry's standard benchmark, put the average value of bare agricultural land in England at £8,497 an acre in the second quarter of 2026. Multiply that by 1,000 acres, and you're already at roughly £8.5 million in land value alone, before you count a single barn, a single shop till, or a single pint sold at the pub. That number clears the £1 million threshold by a mile. It's not close. And that's the quiet part almost nobody says out loud when they cover this story. This was never only a policy about small, struggling family farms on the margins. It's a policy that reaches all the way up to one of the wealthiest farmers in the country, and he knows it, which is exactly why he was standing in Parliament Square in November 2024 instead of somewhere warmer. Prime Minister Keir Starmer had a different answer for the crowd that day. He said he understood their concerns, but he held his line. His own words reported directly, "The vast majority of farms will be unaffected." That single sentence became the fault line of the entire debate, because the vast majority depends entirely on which number you believe. If it's 500 farms a year, Starmer's sentence is almost certainly true. If it's 70,000, it's close to the opposite of true. And here's the detail that even people who followed this story closely never fully connected. The BBC's own fact-checking unit, BBC Verify, ran the numbers independently and landed somewhere in between the two camps, closer to the government's figure in terms of annual impact, but acknowledging the NFU's larger number reflects something real too. How many farms are asset rich enough to theoretically be caught, even if most won't be hit in any single year? Both sides were technically using real data. They were just measuring completely different things and calling it the same number. That's the actual story hiding inside farmers versus government. It's not a story about who's lying. It's a story about how a single piece of tax law can be simultaneously almost meaningless and existentially threatening, depending entirely on whether you're counting this year's casualties or the next decade's. Now, here's the part that even people who followed every headline on this topic have almost certainly never joined up. This policy took effect this April. It is not a threat sitting in a future budget anymore. It is live. Right now, this year, farms above that threshold are already inside the 20% bracket, and in the 16 months between that Westminster rally and this April deadline, something happened that nobody predicted when 10,000 farmers were shouting outside Parliament. The Prime Minister who introduced it isn't Prime Minister anymore. Keir Starmer resigned on July 20th of this year. He stood outside Downing Street and told the country, in his own words, that his work was done, that he went with good grace and a smile. Andy Burnham, until recently the Mayor of Greater Manchester, became Britain's 7th Prime Minister in a decade that same day. Burnham called his own arrival a circuit breaker for the country and promised a new 10-year economic plan. What he has not done, as of the writing of this, is say one clear sentence about whether the farm tax stays exactly as it is. And the market has noticed. Farmers Weekly's own land tracker data shows the volume of farmland advertised for sale in the first half of 2026 came in almost 25% lower than the same period the year before. Not because farmers suddenly stopped wanting to sell, because nobody currently knows what the rules will look like by the time a sale actually completes. Knight Frank's own rural sales lead put it plainly. The change in Downing Street has yet to provide farmland buyers and sellers with greater clarity over the future direction of tax, agricultural, and environmental policies. Add in higher fuel and fertilizer costs pressing on margins from the other direction, and you have an entire industry holding its breath, waiting to find out if the fight it spent 16 months losing sleep over even has the same opponent anymore. That is not a manufactured cliffhanger. That is the honest, unresolved, real state of this story as it stands today. Let's zoom out from diddly squat, from Ben Ardern's Derbyshire tractor convoy, from the Treasury's spreadsheets, and look at what this actually is underneath all of it. Britain made a promise in 1992 that farmland could pass from one generation to the next without being taxed like a stock portfolio, because a farm's value on paper and a farm's ability to actually generate cash are two completely different things. That promise held for 32 years under governments of both colors. It broke in October 2024 under a chancellor trying to close a fiscal gap in a budget that had to raise money from somewhere, and the farmers who stood in that square weren't just angry about 20%. They were angry that a 3-decade-old piece of certainty had disappeared in a single afternoon, with a number attached to it that nobody outside the Treasury could actually verify. That is the real reframe here. This was never simply a tax rise. It was the moment the end of farming stopped being a phrase two unconnected men reached for on the same cold morning and started being a countdown that is now this year actually running, what's genuinely still uncertain, and this part matters because false certainty is exactly what got both sides into this mess in the first place, is what happens next. Nobody, not the NFU, not the Treasury, not BBC Verify, knows for certain whether the real annual toll lands at 500 estates or 70,000 or somewhere in the wide, uncomfortable space between. Nobody knows whether Andy Burnham's government will leave the policy exactly as Rachel Reeves designed it, soften it, or quietly let it become one more unresolved inheritance from a prime minister who's already gone. What we do know, with total certainty, is that a promise made in 1992 is no longer standing, that it took effect this spring, and that the industry it hit hardest still doesn't know who's actually in charge of fixing it, or whether anyone intends to. Stand back and look at the whole shape of it. A tax exemption that survived 3 decades and 6 changes of government. A budget speech in October 2024. Under a chancellor trying to close a fiscal gap in a budget that had to raise money from somewhere. And the farmers who stood in that square weren't just angry about 20%. They were angry that a 3-decade-old piece of certainty had disappeared in a single afternoon, with a number attached to it that nobody outside the Treasury could actually verify. That is the real reframe here. This was never simply a tax rise. It was the moment the end of farming stopped being a phrase 2 unconnected men reached for on the same cold morning and started being a countdown that is now, this year, actually running. What's genuinely still uncertain, and this part matters, because false certainty is exactly what got both sides into this mess in the first place, is what happens next. Nobody, not the NFU, not the Treasury, not BBC Verify, knows for certain whether the real annual toll lands at 500 estates or 70,000 or somewhere in the wide, uncomfortable space between. Nobody knows whether Andy Burnham's government will leave the policy exactly as Rachel Reeves designed it, soften it, or quietly let it become one more unresolved inheritance from a prime minister who's already gone. What we do know with total certainty is that a promise made in 1992 is no longer standing, that it took effect this spring, and that the industry it hit hardest still doesn't know who's actually in charge of fixing it, or whether anyone intends to. Stand back and look at the whole shape of it. A tax exemption that survived 3 decades and 6 changes of government. A budget speech in October 2024 that ended it in one sentence. 10,000 people in Parliament Square a month later. 2 men who never met saying the same 4 words, days apart for completely different reasons. A threshold that quietly clears even one of the country's most famous, wealthiest farms, based on nothing more exotic than the industry's own published land values. A prime minister who held his line under thousands of furious farmers, and then, 8 months later, resigned anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. And a market that has, in response to all of it, simply gone quiet. Fewer farms for sale, less certainty, and a new government that inherited a fight it never chose. That is not a farming story. That is a story about what happens when a country changes the rules on an entire industry and then changes its own leadership before anyone finds out if the rules were even the right ones. If you've made it this far, you already know more about how this policy actually works than most of the people arguing about it on social media. That's genuinely not an exaggeration. Most coverage of this stopped at the protest footage. I'd love to know one thing from you directly. If you farm, or if you know someone who does, has anything like this ever happened where you live? A promise on land or inheritance that just quietly disappeared one budget at a time. And if you're watching this from outside the UK, does the idea of an asset-rich, cash-poor farmer forced to sell land just to pay a tax bill sound familiar, or completely foreign to how things work where you are? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one on this topic because this is exactly the kind of story where the real detail usually comes from the people actually living it. Thank you as always for watching, and if you want to see exactly how the numbers behind Diddley Squat's own shop and pub actually stack up against a farm this size, that video is on your screen right now.